Dr. Sarah Chen had been working on the Kepler research station for exactly 3 months when the incident happened. The massive orbital facility housed scientists from 12 different species, all working together to study the mysterious energy readings coming from the nearby gas giant. Sarah was the only human aboard, which made her something of a curiosity to her alien colleagues. The station's corridors hummed with activity as beings of various shapes and sizes moved about their daily routines. Sarah had grown accustomed to the sight of the tall, graceful Villani with their flowing tentacle-like appendages and the stocky Grex with their rock-like skin and multiple eyes. But it was the Jacari that fascinated her most. The Jacari were a proud warrior species, standing nearly 8 feet tall with muscular builds covered in thick, dark fur. Their faces resembled a cross between wolves and lions, with sharp teeth and piercing golden eyes. What made them truly remarkable was their strict social hierarchy and their fierce protectiveness over their young. Commander Vextar, the station's Jacari security chief, had initially been skeptical about having a human aboard. Humans were relatively new to the galactic community, and many species still viewed them as unpredictable and potentially dangerous. Sarah had worked hard to prove herself, showing her dedication to the research and her respect for the various alien cultures on the station. On this particular day, Sarah was making her way to the main laboratory when she heard unusual sounds coming from the recreation area. The space had been designed to accommodate the needs of different species, with various environmental zones and play areas. As she approached, she could hear the distinctive chittering and yipping sounds that Jacari cubs made when they were excited or distressed. Sarah paused at the entrance to the recreation area and peered inside. The large room was filled with various pieces of equipment and toys designed for different species' offspring. In the center of the room, she spotted the source of the commotion. 3 Jacari cubs, each about the size of a large dog, were tumbling around together in what appeared to be a game. But something seemed wrong. Their play was more aggressive than usual, and their chittering had taken on a higher, more urgent pitch. Sarah knew enough about Jacari behavior to recognize signs of distress. She looked around for any adult Jacari, but saw none. This was unusual, as Jacari adults rarely left their cubs unattended, especially in a multi-species environment. Sarah hesitated, knowing that approaching Jacari cubs without permission could be seen as a serious breach of protocol. The cubs' distress calls grew louder, and Sarah noticed that one of them appeared to be limping. Her scientific training kicked in, overriding her concerns about protocol. She had studied xenobiology and had some knowledge of Jacari physiology. If one of the cubs was injured, it needed help. Sarah approached slowly, making soft, soothing sounds that she had observed adult Jacari using with their young. The cubs immediately noticed her and stopped their tumbling, their golden eyes fixed on her with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "It's okay," Sarah said gently, crouching down to make herself less threatening. "I'm here to help." The injured cub was favoring its left hind leg, and Sarah could see a small cut on its paw. It wasn't serious, but it was clearly causing the young Jacari pain. The other 2 cubs positioned themselves protectively around their injured sibling, their small growls indicating they weren't sure about this strange, hairless alien approaching them. Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out a basic medical kit that all station personnel carried. She opened it slowly, showing the cubs what she was doing. The injured cub watched her with intelligent eyes, and Sarah could see the conflict in its expression, pain warring with the natural Jacari distrust of outsiders. "I know you're scared," Sarah whispered, "but I want to help you feel better." She pulled out a small antiseptic wipe and held it up where the cub could see it. The young Jacari sniffed the air, its keen senses analyzing the unfamiliar scent. Sarah had learned that Jacari relied heavily on scent for communication and threat assessment. To her surprise, the injured cub took a tentative step toward her. Its siblings immediately became agitated, chittering warnings, but the injured one seemed to sense that Sarah meant no harm. It limped closer, its golden eyes never leaving her face. Sarah remained perfectly still as the cub approached. When it was close enough, she slowly extended her hand, palm up, allowing the young Jacari to catch her scent. The cub's wet nose touched her palm, and she felt the rough texture of its tongue as it briefly tasted her skin. The moment was interrupted by a commotion at the entrance to the recreation area. Sarah looked up to see Commander Vexitar rushing in, his expression a mixture of panic and fury. Behind him were Dr. Krell Tan, the station's Jacari xenobiologist, and several other alien staff members. "Step away from the cubs immediately," Vextar commanded, his deep voice echoing through the room. His hand moved to the plasma weapon at his side, though he didn't draw it. Sarah remained crouched beside the injured cub, her movements calm and deliberate. "The cub is injured," she said evenly. "Its paw is cut, and it needs medical attention." "You have no authority to treat Jacari young," Dr. Krell Tan said, his tone sharp with anxiety. "Our cubs are not to be touched by other species without explicit permission from their pod parents." Sarah understood the gravity of the situation. In Jacari culture, touching another family's cubs without permission was considered a severe offense, sometimes punishable by death. But the injured cub was still standing beside her, no longer showing signs of fear. "I understand your concern," Sarah replied, not moving away from the cub. "But this little one is in pain, and there are no adult Jacari present. I'm not trying to violate your customs, I'm trying to help." The injured cub seemed to sense the tension in the room. It looked between Sarah and the arriving adults, then did something that shocked everyone present. It took another step closer to Sarah and gently grasped the sleeve of her lab coat between its small but sharp teeth. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Every Jacari in the room tensed, their fur standing on end. Commander Vextar's eyes widened in what Sarah recognized as alarm. Dr. Krelltan made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a growl. But Sarah understood what the cub was doing. In Jacari culture, when a cub grasped the clothing or fur of an adult, it was a sign of trust and a request for protection. The young Jacari was essentially claiming Sarah as a temporary guardian, which was unprecedented for a cub to do with an alien. Instead of pulling away or showing fear, Sarah smiled. She gently placed her free hand near the cub's head, not quite touching, but close enough that the young Jacari could feel the warmth of her skin. "It's okay, little one," she said softly. "I understand what you're asking." The room fell silent except for the quiet humming of the station's life support systems. Every alien present was watching this unprecedented interaction with a mixture of fascination and terror. In their experience, non-Jacari species either feared Jacari cubs or were feared by them. No one had ever seen a cub voluntarily seek protection from an alien. Sarah looked up at Commander Vextar, her expression calm and respectful. "I know this is unusual, but your cub has chosen to trust me. I won't betray that trust." The commander's golden eyes studied Sarah intently. She could see him weighing his options, cultural protocols warring with the reality of the situation before him. The injured cub was still holding her sleeve, showing no signs of distress despite the presence of its own species in the room. Dr. Krelltan stepped forward carefully. "The cub's behavior is unprecedented," he admitted. "In all our recorded history, no Jacari young has ever shown such immediate trust to an alien species." Sarah nodded slowly. "Maybe that says something about how we've been approaching interspecies relations. We focus so much on our differences that we forget the things that make us similar." She looked down at the injured cub, whose golden eyes were watching her with what she could only describe as hope. The other two cubs had moved closer as well, their initial wariness giving way to curiosity about this strange alien who spoke so gently and smelled of kindness rather than fear. All young creatures want the same things, Sarah continued. Safety, comfort, and someone to ease their pain when they're hurt. Species doesn't matter when you're a child in need of help. Commander Vexitar exchanged a long look with Dr. Kreltan. Sarah could see them communicating in the subtle way that longtime colleagues do, weighing risks and protocols against the unprecedented situation unfolding before them. Finally, Vextar spoke. The Cubs pod parents are in the deep sleep cycle and cannot be awakened except for true emergencies. We were attempting to locate alternative caregivers when we received the alert about disturbances in the recreation area. Sarah felt a surge of understanding. So the Cubs were left alone, and when one got hurt, they had no one to turn to. Jakari Cubs are normally self-sufficient for short periods, Dr. Kreltan explained, but injuries change the dynamic. An injured cub requires adult attention and care. The injured cub tugged gently on Sarah's sleeve again, then looked up at her with those expressive golden eyes. Sarah could see the intelligence there, the understanding that this strange alien was its best hope for relief from pain. "Let me help," Sarah said simply. "I have medical training, and the cub has already shown that it trusts me. Fighting against that trust might cause more distress than allowing me to treat the injury." The tension in the room was palpable as the Jakari officials considered her words. Sarah knew she was asking them to violate centuries of cultural protocol, but she also knew that sometimes compassion had to supersede tradition. Commander Vexitar finally nodded slowly. "Proceed," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of his decision. "But you will follow our protocols exactly, and Dr. Kreltan will supervise every step." Sarah smiled, feeling the cub's grip on her sleeve relax slightly, as if it understood that help was finally coming. She looked around at the assembled aliens, all watching this moment that would later be discussed in xenological circles across the galaxy. "Thank you," she said simply. "I won't let you down." As Sarah began to carefully examine the cub's injured paw, she couldn't help but think about how this moment represented something larger than just treating a small wound. It was about building bridges between species, about trust overcoming fear, and about the universal language of compassion that transcended all cultural barriers. The injured cub remained calm as Sarah worked, its trust in her complete and unwavering. And in that trust, everyone present began to understand something new about the humans and their remarkable capacity for empathy. Sarah worked with steady, gentle movements as she cleaned the injured cub's paw. The young Jakari remained remarkably still, occasionally letting out soft whimpers, but never trying to pull away. Dr. Kreltan watched every movement with intense scrutiny, ready to intervene if he detected any sign of improper procedure. "The cut is clean," Sarah murmured, more to herself than to the watching aliens. "No signs of infection, and it's not deep enough to require stitches." She looked up at Dr. Kreltan. "Do you have Jakari-compatible antiseptic in your medical supplies?" The Jakari physician nodded and produced a small container from his kit. "This contains healing compounds that are safe for our young. However, the application process requires specific techniques to avoid causing additional stress." Sarah accepted the container and examined its contents. The antiseptic had a slightly blue tint and smelled of something resembling mint mixed with ozone. "What's the proper application method?" Dr. Kreltan demonstrated on his own hand, showing how the compound should be applied in gentle circular motions while making specific low-frequency humming sounds. "The humming helps to calm our young during medical procedures. It mimics the vibrations that pod parents produce when comforting cubs." Sarah nodded and began to apply the antiseptic exactly as demonstrated. To everyone's surprise, she also began to hum, though her human vocal cords couldn't produce the exact frequency that Jakari used. Instead, she hummed a soft lullaby her own mother had sung to her as a child. The effect on the cubs was immediate and remarkable. Not only did the injured one relax further, but the other two cubs moved closer, their earlier wariness completely forgotten. They seemed fascinated by the unfamiliar melody, their heads tilting as they listened. Commander Vextar stepped closer, his expression showing amazement. "How did you know to modify the calming technique for your own species' vocal range?" "I didn't know it would work," Sarah admitted, carefully wrapping the cub's paw in a soft bandage. "But young creatures of all species respond to soothing sounds. I thought it was worth trying." Dr. Krelton made notes on his data pad, his scientific curiosity clearly aroused. "Your instinctive understanding of interspecies care techniques is remarkable. Most species require extensive training to work effectively with alien young." Sarah finished bandaging the paw and sat back on her heels. The injured cub immediately pressed against her leg, a rumbling sound coming from its throat. She looked questioningly at Dr. Krelton. "It's purring," he explained, his voice filled with wonder. "Jakari cubs only purr when they feel completely safe and content. I have never heard of a cub purring for an alien." The other two cubs had moved even closer, and Sarah found herself surrounded by curious young Jakari. One of them began investigating her hair with its nose, while the other examined her hands with obvious fascination. "They're so intelligent," Sarah observed. "I can see them trying to understand what I am, how I'm different from their own species." "Jakari cubs are indeed highly intelligent," Commander Vextar confirmed. "They begin learning social hierarchies and species identification from the moment they open their eyes. What puzzles me is their complete acceptance of you. Normally, our young are cautious around unfamiliar species." Sarah gently stroked the injured cub's head, careful to avoid any movements that might be interpreted as threatening. "Maybe it's because I'm not trying to establish dominance or showing fear. I'm just being present with them." As if to prove her point, the cub that had been investigating her hair suddenly grabbed a strand in its mouth and tugged gently. The watching aliens tensed, but Sarah simply laughed. "That's my hair, little one," she said, gently extracting the strand from tiny teeth. "It's attached to my head." The cub made a chittering sound that Dr. Krelton identified as laughter. "It finds your explanation amusing. Jakari cubs have an excellent sense of humor." The third cub had discovered Sarah's medical kit and was sniffing at the various instruments with obvious curiosity. Sarah carefully moved the more dangerous items out of reach while leaving some harmless objects for the cub to explore. "In my species," Sarah said, "we believe that curiosity is one of the most important traits a young creature can have. It leads to learning, growth, and understanding." "An interesting philosophy," Commander Vextar remarked. "Jakari cubs are also highly curious, but we usually try to channel that curiosity within safe parameters." Sarah watched as the cubs explored their immediate surroundings with renewed energy, their earlier distress forgotten. "Sometimes the most important learning happens outside safe parameters. Not dangerous situations, of course, but opportunities to experience new things." Dr. Krelton looked up from his notes. "Are you suggesting that our cubs might benefit from more exposure to other species?" "I'm not qualified to make suggestions about Jakari child rearing," Sarah replied diplomatically. "But these three seem to be enjoying learning about humans. Maybe that's valuable in itself." The injured cub had settled comfortably against Sarah's side, occasionally looking up at her with obvious affection. The other two cubs had begun a game of chase around the immediate area, their energy returned now that they knew their sibling was safe. Commander Vextar received a communication through his neural implant and held up a hand for silence. After a moment, he frowned. "We have a problem. The cubs' pod parents will remain in deep sleep for another 6 hours due to complications with their medical procedure. Our other available caregivers are all occupied with emergency duties. Dr. Kreltan looked concerned. These cubs cannot be left unattended for that length of time, especially with one injured. What about temporary caregivers from other species? Sarah asked. Impossible, Commander Vextar said firmly. Jakari cubs have never been cared for by non-Jakari. The cultural barriers are too significant, and the potential for misunderstanding too great. Sarah felt the injured cub press closer against her as if sensing the tension in the room. What if I stayed with them? They already seem comfortable with me. The suggestion caused an immediate stir among the watching aliens. Several other species representatives had arrived during the medical treatment, drawn by curiosity about the unprecedented situation. Now they muttered among themselves in various languages, their tones suggesting surprise and concern. Absolutely not, Commander Vextar said immediately. The responsibility is too great, and the potential for cultural violation too high. With respect, Commander, Sarah said gently, your cubs have already shown that they trust me. Fighting against that trust might be more disruptive than working with it. Dr. Kreltan stepped forward. There is precedent in our ancient histories for emergency fosterage, though it has never been applied to alien species. In times of extreme need, cubs can be temporarily cared for by approved individuals outside their immediate pod. Commander Vextar's expression showed his internal struggle. The regulations are clear. Non-Jakari cannot be granted care authority over our young. Then don't grant me authority, Sarah suggested. Let Dr. Kreltan maintain official responsibility while I provide practical assistance. I'll follow his directions exactly. The injured cub looked up at Sarah and made a soft questioning sound. She could see intelligence in its golden eyes, an awareness that important decisions were being made about its immediate future. The cubs are already bonded to her, Dr. Kreltan observed. Separating them now and placing them with unfamiliar Jakari caregivers could cause significant emotional distress. Commander Vexitar walked to the far end of the room and activated his private communication device. Sarah could see him having an intense conversation with someone, probably his superiors. Meanwhile, the cubs continued their exploration, occasionally returning to Sarah as if she were their anchor point in an uncertain situation. "How do you do it?" asked Dr. Torvin, a Villani xenopsychologist who had been observing silently. His tentacle-like appendages swayed gently as he spoke. "I have studied interspecies relations for decades, yet you achieved more trust in minutes than most accomplish in months." Sarah considered the question carefully. "I think it's because I don't see them as aliens. I see them as children who needed help." "But they are alien," Dr. Torvin pointed out. "Their psychology, their social structures, their very physiology is different from yours." "Their need for comfort when hurt isn't different," Sarah replied. "Their desire to feel safe isn't different. Their curiosity about the world around them isn't different. Those are universal traits of young, intelligent creatures." The Villani scientist made notes on his data pad. "Your species' capacity for emotional intuition continues to surprise the scientific community. Most species require extensive study to understand the emotional needs of other species. Maybe we understand because we remember what it was like to be young and vulnerable ourselves," Sarah suggested. "Empathy isn't about knowing facts. It's about recognizing shared experiences." Commander Vextar returned from his communication session, his expression grim. "My superiors are concerned about the precedent this might set. However, they acknowledge that the cubs' welfare must be our primary consideration." He paused, looking at Sarah with an unreadable expression. "You will be granted temporary emergency assistance status under Dr. Kreltan's direct supervision. Any deviation from approved procedures will result in immediate termination of this arrangement." Sarah felt a surge of relief and responsibility in equal measure. "I understand completely. I won't let you down." "There are conditions," Commander Vexitar continued. All interactions must be documented for review by the Cultural Ethics Committee. You must follow Jacari protocols exactly as instructed. And if the cubs show any signs of distress, the arrangement ends immediately. Of course, Sarah agreed. Dr. Kreltan approached with a data pad full of information. I need to brief you on basic Jacari cub care protocols, their feeding schedule, sleep requirements, play behavior, and emergency procedures. As Dr. Kreltan began his briefing, Sarah found herself surrounded by 3 curious cubs who seemed perfectly content with the arrangement. The injured one remained close to her side, while the other 2 had begun investigating the various alien observers with renewed confidence, as if Sarah's presence gave them courage to explore. "This is remarkable," whispered Dr. Shex, a Grex anthropologist. "The cubs are using her as a secure base for exploration." "It's a behavior pattern we typically only see with their own species." Sarah listened carefully to Dr. Kreltan's instructions while keeping one eye on the cubs' behavior. She was beginning to understand the subtle signs of their communication, the different pitches of their chittering, the meaning behind various tail positions, the significance of their ear movements. "You're absorbing this information remarkably quickly," Dr. Kreltan observed. "It usually takes weeks for new Jacari caregivers to learn these behavioral cues." "Children are children," Sarah said simply. "Once you understand the basics of what they need, the specific details start to make sense." As the briefing continued, Sarah found herself thinking about the larger implications of this moment. She was about to become the first non-Jacari to care for Jacari cubs, crossing cultural and species boundaries that had never been crossed before. The thought was both exciting and terrifying. The injured cub looked up at her and made a soft sound that Dr. Kreltan translated as a request for attention. Sarah gently scratched behind its ears, and the purring resumed immediately. "I think this is going to work out just fine," she murmured, more to herself than to the watching aliens, but she had no idea just how challenging and rewarding the next 6 hours would prove to be. The first 2 hours passed smoothly. Sarah had settled into a rhythm with the 3 cubs, guided by Dr. Kreltan's careful instructions. She had learned to interpret their different vocalizations and body language, understanding when they needed food, water, or simply attention. The injured cub stayed close to her, but was moving around more freely as the pain medication took effect. The real test came when feeding time arrived. Dr. Kreltan produced 3 containers of what looked like thick, protein-rich paste, mixed with chunks of synthesized meat. Jacari cubs require specific nutritional components for proper development. They must consume this mixture 3 times per day, and the feeding process requires careful monitoring. Sarah examined the food, noting its texture and smell. To her human senses, it resembled a cross between baby food and pet food, but she kept that observation to herself. "What's the proper feeding technique?" "Jacari cubs are social feeders," Dr. Kreltan explained. "In their natural environment, they would feed together while adults supervise for safety and social bonding. The caregiver must establish themselves as the pack leader during feeding time." Sarah looked at the 3 cubs who had perked up at the sight of the food containers. Their golden eyes were fixed on the meals, and she could hear low rumbling sounds coming from their stomachs. "How do I establish pack leadership?" she asked. "Traditionally, the alpha feeds first, then gives permission for the cubs to eat," Dr. Kreltan said. "However, you cannot actually consume their food, so you will need to simulate the behavior." Sarah nodded, understanding the challenge. She needed to assert gentle authority without actually eating alien food that might be harmful to her human physiology. She thought for a moment, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a nutrition bar from her own supplies. The cubs watched with fascination as Sarah unwrapped the bar and took a deliberate bite. She chewed slowly, making sure they could see her eating behavior. Then she made eye contact with each cub in turn and nodded slowly. "Your turn," she said gently, placing their food containers on the floor. The cubs immediately understood and began eating enthusiastically. Dr. Kreltan looked amazed. Your intuitive understanding of pack dynamics is remarkable. You essentially told them that you had established the safety of the feeding environment by eating first. It made sense, Sarah said, watching as the cubs ate. Young animals often learn by observing adult behavior. I showed them it was safe to eat by eating myself. The feeding proceeded without incident until one of the cubs began choking on a large piece of food. The other aliens immediately tensed, but Sarah acted quickly. She had noticed during her briefing that Jakari anatomy was similar to some Earth mammals in certain ways. Without hesitation, she carefully lifted the choking cub and applied gentle pressure to its abdomen while supporting its head. After a few seconds, the obstruction was dislodged, and the cub began breathing normally again. The room erupted in excited chatter from the various alien observers. Commander Vexitar stepped forward, his expression showing both relief and amazement. How did you know the correct procedure for Jakari choking rescue? He demanded. Sarah was still holding the recovered cub, who was now purring contentedly. I didn't know if it would work, but the anatomy seemed similar to some species on my world. I figured the worst that could happen was that it wouldn't work, and then you could try your methods. Dr. Kreltan was taking rapid notes. Your willingness to take calculated risks in emergency situations is fascinating. Most species would have sought expert guidance before attempting intervention. Sometimes you don't have time for expert guidance, Sarah replied. Sometimes you just have to trust your instincts and hope for the best. The rescued cub seemed to have bonded with Sarah even more strongly after the incident. It refused to leave her side, even when its siblings tried to coax it into playing. Sarah didn't mind the constant companionship. In fact, she found the cub's trust deeply moving. Hour 3 brought a different challenge. The cubs were becoming restless and irritable, showing signs of overtiredness but refusing to sleep. Dr. Kreltan explained that Jakari cubs often had difficulty with sleep cycles when their routine was disrupted. Normally, their pod parents would sing them traditional sleep songs, he said. The melodies have specific frequencies that induce relaxation in young Jakari. Sarah listened to the recording Dr. Kreltan provided, analyzing the rhythm and tonal patterns. The songs had a haunting quality, with complex harmonies that seemed designed to calm and soothe. I can't reproduce those exact frequencies, Sarah admitted, but maybe I can try something else. She sat down in the center of the recreation area and began to sing, not the Jakari sleep song, but a lullaby from Earth that her grandmother had taught her. The melody was simple and soothing, with a gentle rhythm that seemed to match the cub's natural breathing patterns. The effect was gradual but unmistakable. The 3 cubs slowly gathered around Sarah, drawn by the unfamiliar but comforting sounds. One by one, they settled down beside her, their eyes growing heavy as the soft melody continued. Remarkable, whispered Dr. Torvin. You've essentially created an interspecies lullaby. The cubs are responding to the emotional content of your song rather than the specific frequencies. Sarah continued singing until all 3 cubs were peacefully asleep, curled up against her like a living fur blanket. She remained very still, not wanting to disturb their rest. This is unprecedented, Commander Vexitar said quietly. I have never seen cubs adapt so completely to an alien caregiver. Hour 4 brought visitors. Word of the unprecedented situation had spread throughout the station, and representatives from various species had come to observe. Sarah found herself the center of attention while trying to maintain the cubs' peaceful environment. A delegation of crystalline beings, whose communication was based entirely on light patterns, flickered questions at Dr. Kreltan about human caregiving techniques. A group of gaseous ethereals swirled nearby, their electromagnetic fields pulsing with curiosity. The galactic scientific community is taking great interest in this event, Dr. Torvin informed Sarah. Your species' apparent natural affinity for interspecies bonding is being studied intensively. Sarah looked down at the sleeping cubs, feeling a protective instinct she hadn't expected. I hope they remember that these are real children, not just research subjects. That perspective is exactly what makes your species unique, Dr. Kreltan observed. Most species view alien young with scientific detachment. You see them as individuals deserving of care and protection. During Hour 5, Sarah faced her biggest challenge yet. One of the cubs woke up crying inconsolably, showing signs of severe separation anxiety for its missing pod parents. Nothing Dr. Kreltan suggested seemed to help, and the cub's distress was affecting the other two. Sarah sat with the distressed cub, letting it cry while making soft, comforting sounds. She didn't try to stop its tears or distract it with toys. Instead, she simply held it and let it express its emotions. "You miss your parents," she said gently. "That's natural. It's okay to be sad when the people you love aren't here." The watching aliens were puzzled by her approach. "Should you not attempt to cease its distress?" asked a mechanical representative through its translator unit. "Sometimes the best way to help someone feel better is to let them feel bad first," Sarah explained. "Emotions aren't problems to be solved. They're experiences to be acknowledged and worked through." Gradually, the cub's crying subsided. It looked up at Sarah with tear-filled eyes and made a soft, questioning sound. Sarah interpreted this as a request for reassurance. "Your parents will come back," she promised. "They're just sleeping so they can get better. When they wake up, they'll be here for you again." The cub seemed to understand the emotional content, if not the specific words. It nestled against Sarah and gradually calmed down, though it continued to make occasional sad sounds. "Your species' emotional intelligence is extraordinary," Dr. Torvin observed. "You understood that the cub needed to process its emotions rather than simply having them suppressed." By Hour 6, Sarah had developed a deep affection for all three cubs. The injured one had recovered remarkably well and was walking normally. The anxious one had found comfort and was playing quietly. The curious one had explored every safe object in the recreation area and was now content to rest beside Sarah. When the alert came that the cub's pod parents were waking from their deep sleep cycle, Sarah felt an unexpected pang of sadness. She had grown attached to these remarkable young creatures, and saying goodbye would be difficult. Commander Vextar received the communication and nodded to Sarah. "The pod parents are requesting immediate reunion with their cubs. They have been informed of the unusual circumstances and wish to meet you personally." Sarah gently woke the sleeping cubs and explained that their parents were coming. Their excitement was immediate and overwhelming. They began chittering and bouncing around the room with renewed energy. When the pod parents arrived, Sarah was struck by their imposing presence. Both adults stood nearly 8 feet tall, with the characteristic golden eyes and thick fur of their species. But what surprised her was the gentleness in their expressions as they looked at their cubs. The reunion was emotional and intense. The cubs rushed to their parents, purring loudly and trying to tell their story all at once through rapid chittering and body language. The parents listened carefully, occasionally looking toward Sarah with expressions she couldn't quite read. Finally, the female pod parent approached Sarah directly. Her voice was deep and resonant when she spoke in carefully pronounced Standard Galactic. "I am Kithara, pod mother to these cubs. I understand you cared for them during our unavoidable absence." Sarah stood and inclined her head respectfully. "It was my privilege. Your cubs are remarkable, intelligent, curious, and incredibly brave." Kithara studied Sarah for a long moment. Then, to everyone's surprise, she extended her large hand in what Sarah recognized as an offer of physical greeting. Sarah accepted the handshake, noting the careful control the Jakari used to avoid injuring her smaller human hand. "Thank you," Kithara said simply. "You have given my family a gift that can never be repaid." The male pod parent, Dexmore, joined them. "Our cubs speak of you with great affection. This is unprecedented in our experience." "They're wonderful children," Sarah replied sincerely. "Any species would be proud to have young ones like these." Kithara made a decision that would echo throughout the galactic community for years to come. "You are hereby granted the status of honorary pod sister to our family. This is a rare honor, never before extended to an alien species." The implications of this gesture were immediate and far-reaching. An honorary pod sister had the right to visit the cubs at any time, to participate in their education, and to be considered part of their extended family structure. Commander Vextar looked stunned. Pod sister status has never been granted to non-Jakari. This will require review by the Cultural Council. "The Cultural Council will accept our decision," Dexmore said firmly. "Our cubs have chosen her as family. We honor their choice." As Sarah prepared to leave the recreation area, each cub came to say goodbye in their own way. The formerly injured one gently grasped her sleeve one more time, the same gesture that had started everything. The anxious one pressed against her leg and purred. The curious one brought her a small toy as a gift. "I'll see you again soon," Sarah promised, accepting the toy with genuine emotion. As news of the day's events spread throughout the station and beyond, Sarah became the subject of intense scientific interest. Her actions had demonstrated human capacity for interspecies empathy in ways that would reshape galactic understanding of her species. But for Sarah, the most important outcome was much simpler. She had helped 3 children when they needed it most, and in doing so, had found a new family among the stars. The cub that had bitten her sleeve had changed everything, not through aggression or fear, but through trust. And that trust had opened doors between species that many had thought would remain closed forever. In the weeks that followed, Sarah would become the first human to study Jakari child psychology formally. Other species began requesting human consultants for their own interspecies programs. The incident had proven that empathy could transcend any barrier, and that sometimes the most profound connections happened when species simply treated each other as fellow beings deserving of kindness. The galaxy would never look at humans quite the same way again.